Libertarianism, a political philosophy that holds liberty as a core value, promotes capitalism as the only viable economic system, defends private property rights above anything else, and advocates for only minimal state intervention in the free market and the private life of individuals. It's present both in right-wing and left-wing groups. This video essay focuses on the latter part of the spectrum, the right wing. Libertarianism has roots in the philosophy of John Locke and other liberal thinkers, and its modern-day form was laid out by Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman as an alternative to the Keynesian welfare state that became the norm following the Great Depression. They wanted to create a new form of economic liberalism without the flaws that led to the Great Depression, and without a strong welfare state and its social safety net, neoliberalism. It has been popularized as an alternative to what they call crony capitalism and socialism as libertarianism. It's mainly pushed for by those who believe that state intervention is the reason for any economic downturn. It's the doctrine of laissez-faire, let be. Libertarianism is based on a naturalist philosophy in ethics, which pretends that societal institutions obey to natural law. According to them, society is regulated like the movement of planets and escapes human control or intervention. The free market is the mechanism of social and economic coordination, and its laws are as inflexible as nature itself. An invisible hand, like God, harmonizes production and efficiently distributes resources to achieve the best possible outcomes. Private property should thus be left alone to be handled by this invisible hand. According to Hayek, society is similar to cosmos, where everything has a purpose and should be left to do its thing. From these assertions, any intervention by the state in the free market is superfluous. From this understanding of right-wing libertarianism, my goal is to show that libertarians have a poor and surface-level comprehension of socio-economic issues, material reality, and capitalism itself. Analyzing and deconstructing libertarianism takes a while, but its simplistic world outlook makes it that much easier.
Relax and take notes while I take totes of the marijuana smoke.
The first thing I want to analyze is the entity of the state and its interaction with the market throughout the development of capitalism, as well as the concept of the market in the first place. Libertarians separate state and market, arguing that the former is nothing but an obstacle to the latter's prosperity, that state intervention in the economy should be lifted to let be the markets and their actors. Let's deconstruct this claim and analyze its validity. In actuality, the state and the market have mostly always overlapped, as a natural development of capitalism. The state's role has been to achieve the desired outcomes of a given society and protect its actors. This ties in with the laissez-faire theory of spontaneous order, which argues that capitalism, free markets, and individuals pursuing their self-centered interests are a natural system that creates harmony. For Hayek, the social reality can only be explained through the process of natural selection. However, he doesn't apply this natural selection to individuals only, but to societal practices that allow better adaptation to circumstances. This reference to Darwin legitimizes this neoliberal ideology by giving it a seemingly scientific basis. But he does not appeal to Darwin, instead to Spencer, a philosophical evolutionist and a hardline classical liberal. He argues that capitalism is natural evolution of social behaviors and arose by itself. This myth assumes capitalism is a natural evolution of societies, when the conditions that gave rise to the capitalist mode of production were not developed naturally. There needed to be established, from egalitarian societies, a class of people who depend on selling their labor power to another, a higher class of exploiters, simply to subsist. This class development was not natural, but instead elaborately constructed through policies of expropriation and reattribution of property to this latter class of capitalists, privatizing and concentrating land and property in the hands of an increasingly small minority of capitalists. This process in the UK saw the development of the wage labor system and more broadly of capitalism. This direction towards capitalism was enforced by a state. This is known in Marxist economics as primitive accumulation, the disposition of property from the masses of small producers and landowners for the capitalists. From there, we can conclude that the state was an instrument for the development of capitalism. Its current role in the developed capitalist economy is left to analyze. We can start with a rather simple concept, cronyism. The warning signs for this were there 100 years ago but were promptly laughed off as the market could never collaborate against the workers' will and well-being. However, this is being disproven by the day, with lobbying, the prison, military-industrial complex, imperialism, and so on. Cronyism is not a bad application of capitalism, rather it's self-inaction. The very thing capitalism becomes to protect private property, ensure ever-growing profits and protect the markets from collapsing. We cannot claim corporatism to be independent of capitalism if the framework for its development is capitalism. Diving into Marx's theory, Marx, Engels, and Lenin foresaw and dreaded the collaboration between the bourgeoisie and the state. Lenin analyzed that in Imperialism when he talked about the concentration of finance capital that resulted in its exportation, resulting in the division of the global south between powers. Corporations like the United Fruit Company tied themselves to the state, and its actions resulted in the CI's overthrow of democratically elected socialist governments that were nationalizing the fruit industry to end the exploitation of their working class. We are now dealing with the consequences of this class collaboration as capitalists defend their system by pretending that the market itself did not create it. The nature of capitalism in the bourgeois state create those conditions. No free market could ever hope of addressing these issues. Even though free markets are theoretically optimal with supply and demand guided by an invisible hand to allocate goods efficiently, they are, in reality, subject to manipulation, artificial inflation of supply and demand, depending on the need for short-term profit, misinformation, asymmetries of power and knowledge, and foster extreme wealth inequality. Regulation by the state is aimed at balancing the virtues of free markets against their bigger pitfalls. The concept of the invisible hand is also worth looking into to deconstruct it. This concept was brought into this world by Adam Smith, though only mentioned 3 times in his entire work. The book Manipulated by Thierry Beauchamp examines very well how the 3 metaphors of the invisible hand meant something much different. This distortion of Smith's work comes from The Wealth of Nations, where he argues that society is guided solely by egoism, which is the engine of the economy. Everyone is motivated by their own self-centered, egotistical interest, which encourages them to innovate and to surpass themselves. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect your dinner, but rather from the care they bring to the search for their own interests. We do not defer to their humanity, but to their selfishness. From this assertion, Smith draws 2 conclusions. The first one is that the individual pursuing his own interest is guided by an invisible hand in order to achieve a societally desirable goal. Society is therefore a harmony of human characteristics that obey an instinctive force. The second one is that the pursuit of one's own self-centered interest is not an obstacle to the common good and brings about societal harmony. This is the theory of harmonization of interests that was seen in Machiavelli's The Prince and La Mandragola. But Smith gives it a bit of nuance and concedes that sometimes the goal of capitalists is contrary to the common good. Hayek takes the first part of this for himself. He argues that the market is a system thanks to which everyone has the highest level of income in recorded history. We can see the flaw in this thinking when the CEO of General Motors says, "What is good for General Motors is good for the United States." This really hasn't held true, with automobile-dependent infrastructure destroying the quality of life of millions of Americans and causing an unneeded expense, creating car-dependent suburbia that bankrupts cities and prevents upward mobility for hundreds of thousands of people, all for the benefit of General Motors. Going back to the topic, arguing that state intervention in the economy is the reason for economic pitfalls is naive, as the state is the only entity refraining market forces from destroying local economies and fostering even worse inequalities. For example, in the case of housing, there is much needed state intervention for the well-being of the population. People need housing and the equilibrium price can be extremely high. We've understood that and set a price ceiling on rent. This policy artificially decreases supply, creating a disequilibrium, which can then be fixed through encouraging densification and mixed-use zoning, or simply building social housing for those who cannot afford artificially inflated market price rent. A similar thing goes for price floors, like in the case of Quebec's dairy market. We have a quite small one compared to the US, which wants to export their surplus milk to our grocery shelves. Certainly this would put thousands of jobs at risk throughout the province, as smaller producers will struggle to compete with huge American multinationals. There, state intervention to set the price floor is necessary, as it protects our local economy. Planning production and establishing quotas is a very important aspect of agriculture, like storing grain in government warehouses and coordinating production, all to ensure a steady output of crops throughout the years. Regulation on wages, working conditions, and pollution are also much necessary. When pursuing profit, businesses have historically damaged the environment to a great extent. abuse labor, and scam consumers out of their hard-earned money. In addition, some regulations are essential for competitive businesses. In any scenario, we have regulations, institutions, and other entities to limit the excesses of a free market. The system itself is broken, and this state is the only thing keeping it from completely falling apart, by consolidating its power through concessions to the working class. It's important to remember that capitalism as an economic system is a stage of development based solely on the pursuit of further profit, with quality of life improvements being accidental products, not inherent to it. The proof being the global collapse of capitalism in 1929, which led to the adoption of Keynesian economic policies. Welfare policies appeased the working class and slowed down the revealing of the contradictions within capitalism that gave rise to communist revolutions. The standard of living we have right now in the West is better despite capitalism, not because of it. They are bound to increase with economic development, industrialization, and innovation. These are not intrinsically linked to capitalism. They exist independently of it. However, this quality of life is currently falling, and will continue to fall, as late-stage capitalism exposes its inner contradiction. Our incomes are stagnating, not even being indexed, while inflation ever so increases. Social services are being dismantled, nothing concrete is done to curb climate change, and the global south is done with being exploited, with left-wing leaders taking power all over Africa and Latin America, which will weaken the imperial core and cause capitalism to collapse. When this collapse happens, the most vulnerable people will become homeless and lose their jobs because the economy is now treated as a political facet of the state. We need a certain framework to support those said people with basic necessities, education, and healthcare. In other words, we let markets regulate themselves with minimal intervention or framing to protect workers and consumers. This is most likely why a lot of billionaires advocate for policies like UBI to protect capitalism and further the profits while keeping their wages low, effectively alleviating a contradiction inherent to capitalism. It runs deeper than that. In a 1997 study, Yakovenko showed that even if you create some sort of libertarian laissez-faire capitalist society from the ground up, starting everyone with the same amount of money, it would lead to an exponential distribution of wealth, where the randomly wealthy tail can't command a disproportionately large amount of labor to generate a snowball effect in their favor. We'd always see wealth distribution shifted towards the top 0.1% in any given market system.
Relax and take notes while I take totes of the marijuana smoke. Throw you in a choke, gun smoke.
This brings me to voluntarism. It's crucial to understand that voluntary contracts can still be coercive, exploitative, and oppressive if there is no alternative except to submit to them, the so-called illusion of false choice. This removes freedom and opportunity for everyone who shows up late to the party, or is left at large. Multi-generationally, this creates great wealth inequality. In a real-life example, we can compare the idealized view of capitalism pushed by Milton Friedman and reality. According to Friedman, concurrency protects the consumer from the coercion a seller could have on him, and vice versa. The seller of labor power is on the same foot of equality as the buyer, and they are both linked by a voluntary and free contract where any form of constraint is absent. Any and all are free to participate or not in the exchange because there are other employers. So the Senegalese peasant and the textile factory worker have the same power as a multinational corporation and a voluntary agreement to exchange labor power for a wage, which explains that an Indonesian worker touches 0.2% of the value of a Nike shoe he produces. This is one of the many examples of power being a key factor in the level of consent given by any market actor. Of course, corporations will have more power, and this power imbalance will only decrease if workers unionize and pressure this firm into making concessions. Now, to continue analyzing the flaw in Friedman's thinking. The economy presents a very complex structure, with the market allocating factors of production and regulating itself, like a central heating unit. Ironically enough, this metaphor of a central heating unit has nothing to do with capitalism, and I've just taken it from Paul Cockshott's Towards a New Socialism, where he explains input-output tables constantly adjusting to find production targets in a socialist economy. I believe this is sufficient to understand that the metaphors used by capitalist ideologues like the invisible hand are not reflected in reality. This talk about constantly adjusting targets brings me to the idea of magically optimized markets achieving perfect equilibrium every time. The proof of this shown by Pareto ironically shows the fatal flaw of the free market, that they assume equilibrium under perfect competition, optimizes production, and allocates actors in an optimal way, When perfect competition does not exist, only as an abstraction in the head of economists who do nothing but spend their entire career trying to justify the existence of capitalism. But I digress. This theory supposes that equilibrium prices on a market are known in advance by all its actors, that all enterprises in a given industry are small, of the same size, produce an identical product, that all agents are completely rational, and that there is no barrier to entry. Unsurprisingly, this is impossible to recreate in the material reality and is a completely idealized view of markets, and many economists have conceded that markets are in reality flawed. This is why they separated markets in many different categories: perfect, imperfect, monopolist, and oligopolist. They on one hand realized the need for these changes, and that it's not reflected in reality, but at the same time still cling to old abstractions to continue justifying these inefficient markets. This belief in a supposed efficient market and pure concurrency is a myth. The economic law that is said to govern capitalism is also one of its inner contradictions. The role of the market is to eliminate the idealized market to maximize profit through exploitation, destruction of competition, fraud, and so on. This analysis of the power dynamic brings me to consent to exploitation. Under capitalism, labor power is viewed as a commodity which can be bought or sold like anything else. Libertarians argue that workers can sell that labor power without being subject to force or coercion through a contractual agreement. However, most of the time it's simply not the case. This is like saying a child can consent to sex with a pedophile, without coercion, completely disregarding the age gap and causing an uneven power dynamic. The market agents are not receiving according to their work or needs. In capitalist theory, the property is a sacred extension of yourself, to be used only according to your personal preference. It pushes an idea of natural law, that man is entitled to life, liberty, and estate. From this, we can assume that no one can take another person's life, freedom, or property, and that property can only be exchanged if bought or sold consensually. The worker consents to his exploitation because he is coerced or indoctrinated. Just because the coercion is not physical doesn't make it any less coercive. This is pretty much just semantics, but for your consent to have a meaning, you must be able to retract it. Agreeing to this contract also means being able to withdraw it later on. But in a capitalist system, to retract your consent, you need to have a private property to sustain yourself. The very existence of capitalists depends on the fact that most workers can't say no to a job. Most of the time, the wage is not even up for negotiation either. It's essential to recognize that simply because in one case a worker is satisfied with a contract that pays them a ton of money and fulfills them, therefore consenting to exploitation, does not mean the same thing happens in other cases, let alone the majority of the population. In capitalism, most relations are exploitative and unjust. Just in the same way that desperate people legitimize elections by voting for the same parties over and over again while recognizing that the system is not legitimate. It's a vicious circle. Put shortly, this agreement to exploitation is pretty much just semantics to justify ways in which corporations can manufacture consent. In short, arguing that capitalism is not coercive because you consent to be exploited is missing the point entirely, and shows a surface-level misunderstanding of capitalism.
Relax and take notes while I take totes of the marijuana smoke.
This brings me to the non-aggression principle. According to Ronald Hemingway, the non-aggression axiom is an ethical principle often appealed to as basis for libertarian rights theory. This principle forbids aggression, which is understood to be any and all forcible interference with any individual's person or property, except in response to the initiation, including, for most proponents of the principle, the threatening of initiation, of similar forcible interference on the part of that individual. From there, we can understand that the NEP is composed of two principles. The first one is that you cannot initiate forceful interference with someone's personal property, and the second is that you have the right to defend yourself from someone initiating said forceful interference. On a surface level, this is not necessarily wrong and might seem like a good principle to use as an axiom. However, look past this surface level and its flaws practically show themselves. Libertarians often hypothesize an idealized worldview that is very often in a vacuum. Let's get back to what we Marxists love: material reality. My first criticism goes as follows. The profit motive, which is a key aspect of capitalism, incentivizes actions that violate the non-aggression principle. With the NEP that most libertarians advocate for, firms would be much less incentivized to maximize their profits. It's a contradictory thought. It's also completely idealistic since outsourcing labor and production to the global south would happen on a much larger scale. Firms already do this, with many of them setting up plants to exploit resources on indigenous territories and disregarding those people's sovereignty over their own territory. These companies hold so much power that they can basically disregard any attempt at recognition by indigenous people. The profit motive pushes companies like Nestle and Coca-Cola to steal water sources in the Global South for the sake of profits. It would also be easy for a large corporation to effectively enslave a population of workers to save money in wages, and provide cheaper products as well as undercutting the competition of goods produced more ethically by other firms. The most ruthless businesses win, and those who act more ethically will lose money and fall in market rankings. Therefore, market forces incentivize more slavery and destruction, not less, to stay competitive. Laissez-faire brings about immense amounts of coercion. It lets corporations rule over towns and use coercive means, such as private militias, to take over land and establish monopolies on basic necessities. Though the NAP is much more about the protection of private property than actual aggression or violation of rights. This is illustrated by the next element, which is private courts. For private courts to work, they must have a degree of force and a monopoly and coercion to back up their rulings. In a completely voluntary society, the business owner doesn't have to show up to court. You can't force them to do so, as this will violate the NAP. Then wouldn't a business this controversial have a well-trained private security force to protect this boss? Without a state, you can only punish an individual if they voluntarily go to court, which, shocker, they won't. The profit motive also eradicates the idea of private courts. If I was the CEO of this huge corporation that acts immorally, would I pay more money to make the company ethical, or would I spend less money in order to bribe the largest private courts so they will always rule in my favor? It's clear that they will gain from letting me get away with immoral practices. It's a win-win situation for the oppressors. Private courts are a very implausible proposition. They are far from an effective truth. Privatizing institutions like the police and courts will lead to a situation where entire privatized governments exist, with some people within the same community potentially subscribing to different ones. Laissez-faire is a rejection of the public state in favor of multiple private states. This would shift the power to those big companies, who will rule in their own favor, effectively negating the NAP. Paired with private property, you've just recreated feudalism. Last but not least, liberty. This concept is very abstract and has multiple different meanings depending on the context and application, with 250 listed definitions. First, economic liberty is in contradiction with values like equality and the right to life if a capitalist can put pressure on salaries to organize productive forces as he wishes, including making his workers work in unsafe conditions. On one hand, liberty needs to be restricted for it not to impede other people's liberty, and on another hand, it's just one out of many important values which can restrict it, such as love, justice, equality, and happiness. Many of these are not really objectively quantifiable, so individual liberty is therefore an odd thing to have as a primary value. Liberty is the foundation of all else. This John Locke quote sets the foundation for liberalism, a philosophy where private property and liberty are inextricably connected. Any attempt at redistribution or abolition of private property is seen as an attack on liberty. According to Hayek, political and social liberty depend on economic liberty, that is the right to private property. Liberty is therefore subordinated to capital. In neoliberal doctrine, it can be thus defined as the removal of barriers to profit maximization for the concentration of capital in the hands of a few. But how exactly did Hayek define liberty? According to him, being free is being able to choose the means and the end of his activities. So being free of constraint. There is a constraint where another individual imposes his will on another person's activities. From this, we can assert that Hayek defined liberty as autodetermination, being able to choose one's own path without being submitted to another's will. Ironically though, Hayek then does a 180 and excommunicates another liberal for defining liberty this way, because defining it that way would contradict the nature of capitalism, which actively works against self-determination of oppressed nations. Instead, he defines it as disposing of a protected domain where no other person can intervene in the measure where he respects the law. It would have nothing to do with power, property. If liberty is property, and liberty is the foundation of everything, property is everything, the sole guiding principle of libertarianism. As seen earlier, this is quite problematic considering the tyrannical nature of private property, which seeks to alienate those submitted to it to pursue further profit. But no matter how we define property, it can easily be divided into two aspects: negative and positive liberty. Negative liberty means the absence of something, freedom from. Positive liberty, on the other hand, means the presence of something, like the right to self-determination, freedom to. Since libertarians want to be free from the state, they advocate for negative liberty. To quote Marx, man is free not by the negative force to avoid something, but by the positive force to assert his true individuality. A better understanding of liberty would use this citation. Capital keeps man from self-realization. It imposes its scenario on every individual and controls his life decisions, in the pursuit of profit. Only the abolition of capital and unnecessary work will make man free, as it eliminates the distinction between labor and leisure, humanizes production, and makes careers socially beneficial. This right to self-determination hypothesized by liberals means nothing when it doesn't include the right to participate in any decision-making process. Under capitalism, the decisions are made by those alienated from the production process, in the case of big businesses, bureaucrats, investors, and directors. The allocation of resources, the fate of a shop closing or not, the education and health system, all these decisions are not up to the people under capitalism. Liberty needs to extend to the economic and social aspect, not as in the capitalist sense of freedom of business and private property, but instead of in the freedom of participation and of owning the fruits of one's own labor. People need to have a right to self-realization. In a free market, most do not have startup capital. Everyone needs to have equal access to means to realize themselves. Equality of opportunity. These rights and liberties exist under capitalism but are kept from the masses, only given to capitalists. Freedom can also not exist without a sense of community. The individual lacking a broader community will not only feel alienated but will lack resources and a potential downfall. Without a strong, healthy community, there is no strong individual. Collaboration rather than competition brings about more fulfillment and self-realization and is evidently more deserving of the label of liberty. Furthermore, Hayek and other ultra-liberals were quite against democracy, preferring to limit political liberty in the hands of capital owners, to optimize the free market. This is exactly how neoliberalism works. A military dictatorship is installed, political and economic liberties are limited while the state represses dissent to the free market ideology, while the welfare state services are privatized. This not only breeds inequality and alienation from political, economic, and social spheres of life, but it restricts the freedom it logically comes to. Liberty is thus not defined by negative rights, but by positive rights. In conclusion, free market capitalism is unviable, and more broadly, it is not a good way to organize productive forces. Let's summarize our findings. The first contention is that unregulated capitalism has been elaborately constructed with the collaboration of the state through policies of expropriation, and that it trends towards monopolization of very few firms, inevitably towards imperialism. The state and the market are therefore intertwined and cannot be separated. This rules out any question of cronyism or corporatism. Since the organization of productive forces, the framework which allows this to take place is capitalism. Then, that state intervention and regulation are inevitable and absolutely necessary for preventing the collapse of the market system and protecting market actors, aka the population. Following this, that capitalism depends on private property, which is impossible to protect without a state. Any notion of anarcho-capitalism is ruled out, and only neoliberal states like what we've seen in Chile with Pinochet's stay. Finally, that right-wing libertarianism has completely distorted the notions of consent, exploitation, the human condition, and efficiency, conveniently disregarding negative externalities to justify their positions. If someone wants to argue that the markets regulates themselves, they need to take a look at history, where the most laissez-faire periods of capitalist history quickly led to monopolies and extreme exploitation, which is still happening today in the Third World, the Global South, which libertarians also conveniently ignore because the child slaves are white, I guess. Then its real-world applications have led to massive wealth and income inequality, privatization of social services leading to a lack of an adequate quality of life, and disastrous social impacts in its neoliberal applications in military dictatorships in countries like Chile in 1973. Finally, it distorts the concept of liberty, strips it of its actual meaning, devoid of any social, political, or economic implications, and asserts private property and the market as absolutes. The only reason libertarianism and anarcho-capitalism have some sort of following apart from profit and corporate propaganda is because of their simplicity. It's most prominent in the US, followed by Canada, Brazil, and Australia. It barely exists in other countries, even less oppressed countries victims of moribund capitalism, and no wonder countries like Argentina don't have very prominent libertarian parties. Its main trait is in simplicity. The state is bad and capitalism is good. You need to pull yourself up by the bootstraps, despise poor people, and work hard. It doesn't really dive any deeper into societal issues other than making general statements that most people can agree on. Taxes are too high, I don't like being stolen, I have the right to defend myself. Sure, there's ANCAP and libertarian theory that people can dive into to explain these concepts, but analyzing it shows just how idealist and disconnected from reality it is. This simplicity really serves this ideology where it's the most prominent, the US, as Americans tend to be quite simple in their political thought and stay at a surface level of knowledge, ignoring most socio-economic issues, or externalities, with a lot of American conservatives being deontologists. Most libertarians seem to have arrived at their positions from the starting position of I just want to be left alone, which is respectable, but it's very simplistic. When you dive into lib theory, you find that it remains simplistic and idealist, whereas socialist writers propose a revolution overthrowing the state followed by years of revolutionary restructurings of society, while libertarian writers like Lark and Rose propose if we stop pretending that the government exists, it will cease to exist. It makes for an idea that's easy to spread amongst people looking for a simple answer, and those people will cling on to that answer. That's how people work, and it makes this ideology, along with neoliberalism, pretty sad to see have a following. To end on a good note, it is absolutely unviable, and the inner contradictions of capitalism in the global south will cause it to collapse in the imperial core.